Alright, let's try to summarise what we've learned and indicate a little bit where this is all heading. I'm going to do so using a concept known as national income accounting. It's just keeping track of the flow of economic activity in an economy. I'm also going to introduce you to some notation that we're going to use consistently throughout this course. So, the value of production over a period in an economy is one way of measuring GDP. I'm going to use the letter Y as my shorthand notation for GDP. So whenever you see me write the letter Y like that, I'm talking about GDP. We established previously that the value of production over a period is also going to be equivalent to the value of expenditure over a previous period, over that particular period. Now, that expenditure can take two basic forms. It can be expenditure that occurs domestically, or it can be through exports. In other words, expenditure that is undertaken by people in another country on our GDP. Let me explain what this notation means. Let's start with what is sold domestically. The letter C is going to stand for consumption. Now, households are the only sector in this economy that engage in this sort of consumption. I'm going to put a little d there because this is household consumption on domestically produced goods and services. So when you see me write C, I'm talking about household consumption, and when you see the little letter D, that indicates we're talking about expenditure, about consumption undertaken by households on goods and services that have been produced domestically or in the home economy. G is government expenditure. I'll just do EXP for expenditure. And I is the expenditure undertaken by firms firm investment. So these are the three sources of expenditure from the domestic economy on gross domestic product. The fourth type of expenditure is exports. Now, exports is expenditure not being done by households, government or firms within the domestic economy, but is being undertaken by households, government and firms perhaps in other economies, in other countries. And I'm going to use the letter X as my shorthand notation for exports. So the way to think about what's going on here is that over a period of time, an economy produces some GDP. Over that time period, there will be expenditure on that GDP, and that can either come from households' consumption, government expenditure, or firms' investment, plus the expenditure that comes from other countries, which will show up as exports. Now I want to demonstrate something really important. And this is going to be central to my demonstration of why having a good understanding of what GDP is actually measuring is going to give you already some really important insights into important real-world issues. We have here our expenditure on GDP, as I outlined previously. we know that expenditure equals GDP, which also equals the value of production over that period. We also know that that value of production is equivalent to the income that is generated in the economy over that period. And therefore, GDP can also be viewed as being the sum of business saving, household income, and business tax payments. What we've written on the right-hand side of that little equation is, if you like, all of the ways that the firms distribute their income. They pay some of it to households, they pay some of it to the government, what's left over they keep as their own saving. So GDP, which remember comes from the proceeds of the sales of production, can be divided up into business saving, household income, and business tax payments. Household income can itself then be divided up. If we think about how households might use that income, they can use some of that income for domestic consumption, they can use some of that income for imports, and I'm going to use the letter M as my shorthand notation for imports. They can save some of it, and they can make the tax payments that are required to the government. Note here, I've got saving with the little b superscript. That's going to be my shorthand for business saving. So all we've done in going from that line to that line is to write business saving as SB and to expand out household income into all of the ways that household income can be used: domestic consumption, imports, household saving, and household tax payments. Let's just tidy this up a little bit and use symbols instead of words. What we have here is that the nation's GDP over a particular time period is going to consist of the savings undertaken by business, household consumption, which can be both domestic produced goods and services and imports, household saving, which I'll now represent by SH, and I'll just write T here for the total taxes that are collected by the government. Remember, they come from both households and firms. And let me tidy that up a bit more and just write S now as the total of business saving and household saving. All I've done in this slide is to summarise everything we've done up to date about GDP, recognising the equivalence between production, expenditure and income, and then introducing you to some notation which will enable us to very conveniently write down what's underlying this calculation of GDP. So I'm now going to bring all of this discussion together and show you how having a profound understanding of the nature of gross domestic product actually enables us to say some really important things about some key aspects of the economy. So these two equations pretty much summarise what it is we've now learned about gross domestic product. The gross domestic product can be thought of as being the value of the flow of production that takes place over a particular time period. We'll call that Y. It can also be thought of as the value of expenditure that takes place in the economy, the flow of expenditure over a particular time period. Equivalently, it can be thought of as the flow of income that has been earned in the economy over that particular time period. And here we are recording the various uses to which that income can be put. As you can see, expenditure and income are going to be the same, because these are all ways of valuing a nation's gross domestic product. So let's play around with this, the fact that this expenditure measure and income measure are two equivalent ways of measuring the same thing, gross domestic product. What that means is we can take the amount of domestic consumption in the economy, add to it the amount of government expenditure, add to that firm's investment expenditure, and add to that expenditure from other countries on exports, and over a particular time period, as a matter of logic, that has to be equal to consumption plus imports plus saving plus taxes. Now we can subtract consumption from both sides of that equation, and we're left with something that's going to start looking pretty interesting. Let's write what we have left as follows. Firms' investment is going to be equal to the following. The amount of imports in the economy. Now what I'm going to do is subtract exports from both sides of this equation. So it disappears from the left-hand side and it shows up in the right-hand side as minus x. I'm going to do something similar with government expenditure. I'm going to subtract it from both sides of the equation. And what we have left is also saving. Now I want you to note the following. Let's just focus on that part of the equation, the T minus G. That's the government's budget balance. If that's positive, it's a budget surplus. If it's negative, it's a budget deficit. But let's just keep it in surplus for the purposes of this demonstration. You can think of that as being the government undertaking some saving. Just like you and I, if our income exceeds our expenditure, we are able to save. Well, that's exactly the same for the government. The government's tax income exceeds its expenditure, it's saving. I now want to introduce a very important concept in macroeconomics that we are going to see a lot in this course, the concept of national saving, which I'll abbreviate to NS. As the name suggests, this is the nation's saving. And the nation's saving can be thought of as the saving undertaken by the private sector, that is, the saving that is undertaken by households and firms, business saving, to which we add the saving undertaken by the government. Which means, if we go back to this expression here, the economy's investment, that is the investment expenditure undertaken by firms, is going to be equal over a period of time to the difference between imports and exports plus that national saving. Or to put it another way, if we take investment and subtract from that national saving, that is going to equal the difference between imports and exports. Now you remember earlier I said I wanted to motivate this discussion of GDP by showing how if you really understand the concept of GDP, that can often be enough to start making some pretty insightful statements about important real-world economic issues. And I said the issue I wanted to consider is why in the United States is there an imbalance between imports and exports. And I said there are certain explanations that one sometimes hears about inefficient US industries and so on and so forth. But what this demonstrates is that the difference between imports and exports must, as a matter of logic, which flows from the very concept of gross domestic product, must represent a difference between the investment expenditure being undertaken in an economy and the amount of saving that's being undertaken in the economy. In other words, if you want to understand why it is that in the United States there are more imports than exports, the right way to answer that question is to try to see why in the United States there is more investment than national saving. That's the question you should be seeking to answer if you're trying to understand this observation that imports exceeds exports. And indeed, we can check, because on this second graph here, I've collected the data for saving and investment for the United States. And it's exactly as you would expect. In this period, where the gap between imports and exports was at its narrowest, that corresponds to the period where the gap between saving and investment was also at its narrowest. And when the gap between imports and exports starts widening, that's going to correspond to the period where the gap between investment and saving starts to widen. And this is one of the real strengths of macroeconomics and of properly understanding concepts like gross domestic product. It enables you to focus on what's really important in the economy. So yes, there is some concern in the United States about the extent to which imports exceed exports. Where do we look to understand why that's happening? We need to look at why there is this imbalance between saving and investment. That's the question we need to answer.